Man rescues Mustang Mare from a hunter's trap. What her herd of 5 does next will shock you. The vast, untamed wilderness stretched for miles, bathed in the golden hues of the late afternoon sun. Rolling hills of wild grass swayed in the wind, whispering secrets of the land that had remained unchanged for centuries. Towering rock formations stood like silent sentinels, guarding the stories of the wild Mustangs that had roamed freely for generations. Elias Carter, a rugged man in his late 30s, rode slowly through the open expanse on his trusted horse, Bandit. The deep brown gelding moved with ease, his hooves kicking up small clouds of dust as he followed an old, barely visible trail. Elias wasn't a stranger to these lands. He had spent years tracking wildlife, mapping migration patterns, and admiring the untamed beauty of the Mustangs that ruled these plains. But today there was something different in the air, a stillness, a tension that made Elias straighten in his saddle. He pulled the brim of his hat lower, scanning the horizon, his sharp eyes catching every movement, every shift in the terrain. The wind, usually a steady companion, had quieted, leaving behind an eerie silence. Then, without warning, Bandit stopped. His ears flicked forward, muscles tensing beneath Elias's grip. That's when he heard it. A sharp, desperate whinny pierced the silence. Elias's heartbeat quickened. That was no ordinary call. It wasn't the playful cry of a Mustang greeting its herd, nor was it the commanding neigh of a stallion asserting dominance. This was different. It was raw, filled with pain, panic, and desperation. Bandit shifted restlessly, his instincts kicking in. Elias patted the horse's neck to reassure him, his own pulse now thrumming with urgency. Another agonized cry echoed through the canyon, followed by an eerie silence. "Easy, boy," Elias muttered, loosening the reins. He nudged Bandit forward, guiding him toward the sound. His mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a Mustang caught in a ravine? A foal separated from its mother? As they moved closer, the air grew heavy with an unsettling stillness. The land ahead sloped downward into a dry riverbed, its cracked earth a reminder of how unforgiving this wilderness could be. Elias slowed Bandit to a stop and dismounted, his boots sinking into the loose soil. Then he saw it. A few yards ahead, half hidden by thick sagebrush and twisted tree roots, lay a wild Mustang mare, trapped in a cruel hunter's snare. Elias's breath caught in his throat. The mare was a magnificent creature, or at least she would have been if not for the horrific state she was in. Her coat, once a proud, gleaming chestnut, was matted with sweat and dirt. Her powerful legs were tangled in razor-sharp barbed wire, the metal biting deep into her flesh, leaving behind ugly, bloody wounds. Her chest heaved with every breath, her nostrils flaring as she struggled against her cruel restraints. But the more she fought, the deeper the wire dug into her legs. Every attempt at escape only caused more damage. Elias could see it in her eyes, the sheer, soul-crushing exhaustion. She had been fighting for hours, maybe longer, and now she was losing the will to resist. The once proud mare gave one last weak tug against the trap before her head drooped, her ears pinned back in silent defeat. A deep, guttural sound escaped her throat. Not just pain, but something worse. Surrender. Elias clenched his jaw, anger flaring in his chest. This was no accident. This was a deliberate trap. Someone had set this snare, knowing full well that wild horses roamed this area. Poachers, illegal hunters who captured Mustangs for profit, either selling them to the highest bidder or breaking them for brutal labor. Disgust curled in Elias's gut. The mare's sides trembled, her eyes fluttering shut. If he didn't act fast, she wouldn't make it. Elias stepped forward, slowly, cautiously. And as he did, the mare lifted her head just slightly, her deep, pain-filled eyes locking onto his. A silent plea, a whisper in the wind. "Help me. Would you like me to continue with the next section? The dangerous rescue, a race against time?" Elias knew better than to rush in. A wild Mustang, especially one in distress, would see him as a predator if he approached too quickly. If she panicked, she could injure herself further, or worse, lash out in fear. He took a deep breath, his hands steady despite the urgency burning in his chest. Slow movements, soft voice, no sudden gestures. "Easy girl," he murmured, kneeling a few feet away. He kept his eyes low, avoiding direct contact at first. He didn't want her to feel challenged. Instead, he let his presence settle in the air, giving her time to register that he was no threat. The mare flared her nostrils, sniffing the unfamiliar scent of this human who had dared to enter her world. Her ears flicked back, forward, then back again, undecided between fear and curiosity. Elias extended his hand slightly, palm facing down. No ropes, no weapons, just an offering of trust. "I'm not here to hurt you," he whispered, his voice barely louder than the breeze rustling through the canyon. The mare shuddered but didn't pull away. Her eyes, those deep, dark pools of suffering, locked onto his, searching, questioning. For a long, breathless moment, there was only silence between them. Then, ever so slightly, she let out a slow, exhausted exhale. A small but vital sign that she was beginning to trust him. But Elias knew time was running out. The longer she remained trapped, the more she bled. Elias moved carefully, his hands reaching for the leather pouch strapped to his belt. He pulled out a pair of wire cutters, their edges sharp enough to slice through metal. One wrong move and he could startle the mare into a frenzy. The first wire was wrapped cruelly around her front left leg, the barbs having torn into her soft skin. Fresh blood seeped from the deep gashes, staining the dry earth beneath her. Elias grimaced but kept his expression calm. His emotions wouldn't help her now. With a swift, practiced motion, he clamped the cutters around the wire and squeezed. Snap! The sudden release of tension made the mare jerk, her body tensing for an escape that wasn't yet possible. Elias froze, giving her a second to settle. "Almost there," he said softly, reassuring her. He moved to her other leg, where the barbs had tangled even deeper. This one was worse. The metal had bitten into muscle, and if he wasn't careful, cutting it the wrong way could cause more damage. His hands worked quickly but gently, his heart pounding as he freed one section at a time. The mare trembled under his touch but didn't fight, as if some instinct told her he was her only chance. The last wire held firm around her hind leg. It was the tightest, the most dangerous. Elias swallowed. If she panicked now, she could tear her own leg apart. He steadied his breathing and worked the cutters into position. Snap! The wire snapped apart, curling away like a venomous snake finally defanged. For a moment nothing happened. The mare lay still, as if she didn't yet believe she was free. Then a shift, a flick of the ears, a twitch in the muscles, and then, in a sudden burst of raw instinct, the mare lunged forward. Her powerful legs pushed off the ground, sending dirt flying as she staggered to her feet, swaying unsteadily. Elias took a step back, giving her space, watching as she tested her limbs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, she just stood there, her body shaking, as if trying to comprehend what had just happened. The wilderness around them held its breath. Then she ran, not in fear, not in blind panic, but in pure, unchained freedom. Her wounded legs protested, but she didn't stop. She stretched out, her mane whipping through the wind, her hooves pounding against the earth with newfound strength. Elias watched, his chest tight with something indescribable. Relief, triumph, a deep, unspoken understanding between man and beast. But before she disappeared into the wild, something astonishing happened. The mare halted just for a second. She turned her head, her dark eyes locking onto Elias once more. Not with fear, not with desperation, but with something else entirely. Gratitude. And then, with a final toss of her head, she vanished into the horizon. But Elias wasn't alone for long, because 5 more Mustangs appeared at the top of the ridge, watching everything. Would you like me to continue with 3? The unexpected twist? When the wild comes back? Elias stood frozen, his heartbeat still racing from the intense rescue. The mare he had freed had bolted into the wilderness, her injured legs barely carrying her weight as she disappeared into the thick brush. He had thought his task was done. He had expected silence to return to the wilderness, leaving only the rustling leaves and distant chirping of birds. But something felt off. The air had shifted, thick with an energy he couldn't quite place. Then a sound deep, distant, growing. His body tensed as the earth beneath him vibrated ever so slightly. At first, it was subtle, like the trembling of tree branches in the wind. But within seconds, it grew, rolling through the land like an oncoming storm. Elias turned, his breath catching in his throat as he saw them. 5 Mustangs emerged over the ridge, their silhouettes framed against the golden light of the setting sun. They were moving fast, their muscles rippling under their wild coats, their hooves striking the earth in a synchronized rhythm that sent shockwaves through the ground. The pounding of their gallop grew louder, resembling the approach of a distant thunderstorm, powerful, relentless, unstoppable. Dust swirled around them as they charged forward, their movements raw and untamed. Each stride they took seemed to shake the very air, filling the vast expanse of the wilderness with an electrifying presence. Elias could do nothing but stand frozen, watching as these creatures, these kings of the wild, closed in on him. But what struck him most was their direction. They weren't running aimlessly. They weren't stampeding in fear. No, they were coming straight toward him. For a split second, an old instinct kicked in, the human fear of the unknown, the realization that he was small in the face of such raw power. But he didn't run. He didn't move. He simply watched, mesmerized by the force of nature hurtling toward him. At the head of the group was a stallion unlike any Elias had ever seen before. His coat was a deep, glossy black, shining under the dying sunlight like polished onyx. His mane whipped wildly in the wind, untamed and beautiful, as he led the others with absolute authority. Every movement of his body radiated strength. His muscles flexed with every powerful stride. His nostrils flared. His dark eyes locked onto Elias with an intensity that sent shivers down his spine. This was not just any Mustang. This was a leader, a warrior, the guardian of the herd. The other horses followed him without question, their formation precise yet effortless. There was no hesitation in their movements, no sign of confusion or fear. They moved as one, a single force bound by an unspoken understanding. Elias could feel it, the way they fed off each other's energy, the way they communicated without sound. This was their world, their rules, and he was an outsider in their presence. Then the stallion slowed, his hooves skidding slightly against the dry earth as he came to a halt just a few feet from Elias. The others followed, their breathing heavy, their eyes fixed on him with unreadable expressions. Elias barely dared to breathe. The stallion's gaze was piercing, his chest rising and falling with each deep breath. There was no aggression in his stance, no immediate threat. Yet, neither was there submission. Instead, there was something else, something ancient, something primal. The stallion was studying him, measuring him, deciding what he was. And in that moment, Elias felt small, not in fear, but in awe. He wasn't just looking at a horse. He was looking at the embodiment of the wild itself. Then, something happened that Elias never could have predicted. The stallion, still locked in that silent stare with him, dipped his head slightly. It wasn't a gesture of defeat, nor was it one of aggression. It was something else, an acknowledgement. A moment of silent understanding passed between them, unspoken yet undeniable. The stallion had seen him, not as a threat, not as an intruder, but as something worthy of recognition. Just as Elias was trying to process what had just occurred, a soft, broken whinny cut through the tense silence. His head snapped to the side, and what he saw made his breath hitch in his throat. There, standing on the ridge just beyond the herd, was the mare he had freed. She was still trembling slightly, her legs weak from the struggle she had endured, but she was no longer running. She had come back. Elias stood frozen as the mare took a tentative step forward. The herd remained still, watching her, waiting. She hesitated for only a moment before continuing, her movements slow but deliberate. And then, to his utter disbelief, She closed the distance between them. Elias barely dared to move. The mare was inches away now, her breath warm against his skin. Then, with a gentle, cautious motion, she reached forward and pressed her muzzle against his shoulder. A shiver ran through him. This wasn't fear. This wasn't hesitation. This was trust. The Mustangs shifted, their presence still overwhelming, still guarding their own. The stallion gave one last snort, his gaze lingering on Elias for just a second longer before he reared up on his hind legs, his powerful hooves slicing through the air. Then, in a sharp, commanding motion, he turned and bolted. The rest of the Mustangs followed, including the mare. Elias watched them go, their silhouettes disappearing into the vast wilderness, their thundering hooves fading into the distance. For a long time, he stood there, breathless, his mind replaying what had just happened. He had not only freed a trapped horse, he had witnessed something few ever would, the moment when the wild, untamed world acknowledged a human. For a fleeting second, he had become part of something greater than himself. And in return, the wild had given him something he never expected, its respect. Elias remained frozen, his heart still hammering in his chest as he watched the herd disappear over the ridge. The wilderness had returned to its usual stillness, but something in the air had changed. He had just witnessed something extraordinary, something he could barely comprehend. But just as he was beginning to gather his thoughts, a sound stopped him, a rhythmic beat of hooves against the earth. He turned sharply, his breath catching in his throat as he saw the herd circling back. They weren't running away. They were coming back to him. The black stallion led the charge once again, his presence just as commanding as before. But this time, there was no tension in his movements, no challenge in his gaze. The rest of the herd followed, their eyes fixed on Elias with a strange, almost knowing expression. He had spent years around horses, but this was something entirely different. These Mustangs weren't acting purely on instinct. They were communicating in a way that defied explanation. Before Elias could react, the freed mare stepped forward once more. She was no longer trembling. There was no hesitation in her movements. She moved with purpose, her dark eyes locked onto him as she closed the distance between them. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out again, pressing her muzzle to his chest. This time she lingered. The warmth of her breath seeped through his shirt, and Elias felt an emotion stir deep within him, one he had never expected to feel from a wild animal. Gratitude. It wasn't just an act of curiosity. It wasn't just relief from her rescue. This was something deeper. She was thanking him. Elias swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He had heard stories of wild horses forming bonds with those who showed them kindness, but he had never believed it until now. A deep, satisfied rumble came from behind her, the black stallion. He watched closely, his sharp gaze flickering between Elias and the mare. Then, to Elias's shock, the stallion stepped forward. The massive creature stood just a few feet away, his muscles tense, his nostrils flaring. Elias braced himself, unsure of what would happen next. But then, the stallion did something even more unexpected. He lowered his head, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. His ears flicked forward, his dark eyes softer than before. He let out a slow, heavy breath, and Elias felt the tension in the air dissipate. It was as if the leader of the herd had accepted him. As if responding to the stallion's silent signal, the rest of the herd closed in. Their movements were controlled, precise, as they formed a loose circle around Elias. He wasn't sure whether to be honored or intimidated, but the energy around them wasn't hostile. It was something else entirely, something almost sacred. The Mustangs moved in unison, their heads bobbing slightly as they breathed in the moment. The freed mare remained closest to him, her body partially blocking him from the rest, as if she were still seeking his presence. It was a surreal sight, wild animals acting in a way that defied everything he knew about them. Elias had heard of domesticated horses showing affection, but these were wild creatures. They were supposed to be skittish, untrusting, governed only by instinct. Yet, here they were, standing protectively around him, their bodies creating a barrier between him and the rest of the world. It was as if, in their own way, they were guarding him. Elias exhaled slowly, his mind racing to process what had just happened. He had come into this wilderness expecting nothing more than solitude. Instead, he had become part of something greater, a moment of raw, untamed connection between man and beast. The stallion raised his head again, his ears flicking as he turned toward the horizon. The sun was dipping lower now, casting a golden glow over the landscape. It was time for them to go. He let out a sharp snort, and the rest of the herd responded immediately. They began to move, their powerful bodies shifting as they turned toward the wild terrain that was their home. The mare lingered for only a moment longer. She looked back at Elias, her dark eyes searching his face, as if memorizing him. Then, with one last flick of her tail, she turned and followed her family into the vast, untamed land. Elias stood there long after they had gone, his breath still shaky, his hands still tingling from where the mare had touched him. He had saved a wild horse from a hunter's cruel trap. But in the end, it was the Mustangs who had given him something far greater, an experience that would stay with him forever, a moment where the wild had chosen to trust him. As the Mustangs began to move away, Elias felt an odd sense of loss, as though something deeply significant was slipping through his fingers. The wilderness had returned to its natural rhythm, the wind whispering through the trees, the distant call of a hawk echoing above. But everything felt different now. The bond that had formed between him and the wild horses was something beyond words, something that had changed him forever. The powerful black stallion led his herd with unwavering confidence, his muscles rippling beneath his sleek coat as he took the first steps toward the open plains. The rest followed, their hooves barely making a sound as they moved together, a single unified force that embodied both strength and freedom. Elias could only watch, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been allowed into their world, even if just for a moment, and now he had to let them go. The Mustangs picked up their pace, their movements fluid and effortless. The golden light of the setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape, highlighting their untamed beauty. Elias remained motionless, letting the moment settle over him like a heavy, invisible weight. It was a strange feeling, both fulfilling and heartbreaking. He had done what he set out to do. The mare was free, the herd was whole again, and the wild had reclaimed what was rightfully its own. Yet, deep down, a small part of him wished he could follow. As the stallion reached the crest of the hill, he slowed, his sharp gaze flicking back toward Elias. For a brief second, time seemed to stop. The leader of the herd, the embodiment of raw, untamed power, stood still and acknowledged the man who had interfered in their world, not as a threat, but as something else. A silent understanding passed between them, one that didn't need words. Then, with a final, decisive nod, the stallion turned and disappeared beyond the ridge, his powerful frame vanishing into the endless expanse of the wild. Elias thought it was over. The herd had moved on, and he was alone again. But just as he exhaled, ready to turn back, a flicker of movement caught his eye. His breath hitched. The mare. She had stopped at the edge of the hill, her slender frame silhouetted against the sky. Unlike the others, she hesitated, looking back one last time. Her dark eyes found Elias, and in that instant, it was as if the entire world had narrowed down to just the two of them. There was something in her gaze, something deep, something unspoken. Gratitude, recognition, maybe even a trace of sorrow. Elias felt his throat tighten. He lifted a hand slightly, not expecting her to understand the gesture, but somehow he felt like she did. She exhaled softly, her ears flicking forward as if listening to something only she could hear. Then, with one final swish of her tail, she turned and galloped over the ridge, disappearing into the vast, untamed land where she truly belonged. Elias remained standing there, his heart aching in a way he couldn't explain. The wilderness had returned to its silence, but the imprint of what had just happened would never fade. He had saved a wild Mustang, but in the end, it was she who had given him something even greater. Peace of the wild. A moment of pure, unbreakable connection, and a farewell that would stay with him forever. Elias stood there long after the last traces of the Mustangs had disappeared, the echoes of their hooves still lingering in his mind. The wind swept through the valley, rustling the tall grass as if whispering the secrets of the wilderness. He had come here as just another traveler, but he was leaving as something else. Something had changed within him, something profound, something he couldn't quite name. Saving the mare had not been just an act of kindness. It had been a moment of fate, a test of his own compassion and courage. He had stepped into the world of the wild, not as a conqueror, not as an intruder, but as a man who simply wanted to do the right thing. And in return, he had been given a glimpse into something far greater than himself. The unbreakable spirit of the Mustangs, their unity, their silent, powerful language of trust and gratitude. Looking down at his hands, still bearing scratches from the barbed wire, he felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. He had always admired wild horses, but now, he understood them in a way he never had before. They were more than just creatures roaming the land. They were symbols of freedom, resilience, and the raw beauty of nature itself. And somehow, for a fleeting moment, they had accepted him into their story. Elias knew this experience would stay with him forever, but he also knew it wasn't just his story to keep. It was a lesson, a message that needed to be shared. The world often sees wild animals as something to be tamed, controlled, or even destroyed. But standing there, staring at the empty horizon where the Mustangs had vanished, he knew the truth. They didn't need humans to save them, they needed humans to respect them. The mare's final look had said it all. She had acknowledged him, yes, but she had also chosen her world over his. And that was how it was meant to be. The wild belonged to the wild. It wasn't something to be owned or possessed. It was something to be protected, something to be honored. With one last glance at the land where his life had just changed forever, Elias turned and walked away. But he wasn't leaving with just memories, he was leaving with a mission. This story isn't just about one man and one Mustang. It's about all of us. It's about the way we see the world around us and the choices we make. Will we continue to exploit and destroy, or will we learn to coexist and protect? The Mustangs are still out there, running free, living as they have for centuries. But their future depends on the choices we make today. If the story has moved you, share it. Speak up for the wild horses, for all the creatures that deserve to live in freedom. Because in the end, their survival isn't just about them, it's about us, about what kind of world we choose to leave behind. Elias left the valley that day, but the Mustangs stayed in his heart forever. And maybe, just maybe, this story will stay in yours too.